Whoa. Are you okay? Thank you, Jess, very much. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Lord, for the sun. That's kind of nice. Okay, I'm going to do something tad unusual this morning. As you know, over the years, whenever I speak in chapel, I very often address a question that has come to me in some form or another from somebody, usually from a student, but sometimes from others, sometimes from myself. Actually, I end up asking myself lots of perplexing questions, so that's always a good source. The one thing I have noticed over the years, however, is that I have a distinct tendency to favor questions that have been asked of me recently. I hear a good question, so I'll go home and I'll write it down and I'll throw it in the file. But if I don't get back to it kind of quickly, I lose it. Not literally, but emotionally. It's hard to get up for a question that seemed important a few years ago. But that's going to change this morning because I'm going to take up a question that first came to me, are you ready, 20 years ago. That's right, 2 decades ago, at least. About the time most of you were born. I was young as well, sort of. And the question came from another faculty member here at Gordon, a colleague and a good friend, then as well as now. As I understand it, he asked me this question just in the course of a Normal's Day conversation. Now, I say I understand because I don't actually remember the exact moment that it happened. I do remember the question quite clearly. But the fact is, we had hundreds of conversations on all kinds of things almost all the time. He was something of a mentor for me, still is. A deeply respected human being whom I usually came to with my questions. But apparently not this time, because this time he asked me a question. And apparently as well, I didn't answer it. I say apparently because the other day we were talking and he suddenly said, "Stan, I've got a question for you, for your chapel file." And then he laughed and he said, "Actually, it's a question I asked you quite a while back in the 90s, and I'm still waiting for an answer." I winced, but he smiled, and then he said this: "Why does trembling make sense to God, but not always to us?" That's the question. Why does trembling make sense to God, but not to us? He went on to note a number of places in the Bible where trembling is mentioned, and we just heard a couple of them a few minutes ago, and noted as well a number of Christian and Jewish groups that have employed trembling historically, but not today. At least among Christians in North America. Go to Israel and you'll discover an Orthodox religious party called the Haredim, which literally means the tremblers. And of course, on the Christian end of things, we used to have the Shakers and Quakers. But today, the Shakers are down to just a handful of survivors. And the Quakers don't quake anymore, at least not the ones I know. And so, Stan, I want to know why. Why aren't you answering my question, for one thing? But why no trembling? So, that's the question, finally. And the answer to the first part, anyway, is pretty easy. That is, why have I sat on this question for a few decades? Because it's hard, very hard. Not so much the task of actually figuring out the answer, by the way. I think that's doable. But living with the answer and doing something about it, that's the hard one. That's the thing that sort of has me stymied. And perhaps the reason I've let this one sit all these years. I mean, why do people tremble? Think for a second about the last time that something might have made you tremble, or that you saw someone else trembling. What happened? What was the cause? When I thought about that myself, the most recent example I could come up with was something that happened in California not too long ago. We were visiting family and friends, as we typically do in the summer, and I was taking my early morning walk. as I'm also inclined to do. I actually have ulterior motives for such walks, by the way, since there are really times when I can pray and talk with God. But there are also occasions when I get to enjoy the good earth around me. And quite often I wind up spending a fair amount of time just thanking the Lord for what I'm seeing, the beauty of His creation, you might say. Well, anyway, that was definitely happening on this morning. We were on the Central Coast at the time, and I was walking in the hills just above town, overlooking the bay, and it was just a beautiful morning. And everything was going wonderfully, or so I thought. I was just ambling along and praying, enjoying the crisp morning air, when all of a sudden I saw in front of me, coming down the road in my direction, a lion, the animal type lion. It was a female, I could tell that, looking for a little morning food to share with her cubs, no doubt, and obviously not expecting me, since she kind of stopped and looked up and considered the moment. I did that as well, as you might imagine, but I did something else. I began wondering why I didn't take out a larger life insurance policy, because my good wife was going to need it when I was dead in just a few minutes. It was, in other words, a hugely scary moment, totally unexpected, and something I was unprepared for, which is probably why I felt my knees begin to tremble and my heart beat even faster than it already was from climbing the hill. Fortunately, my brain didn't totally disengage, and I remembered someone saying at some point in my life that the last thing you want to do under such circumstances is turn and run, since the lion will then probably run after you and chase you down. So I just looked at the lion, and I kept walking and veering to the right just a tad, and the lion did the same thing, kind of going the other direction. Kept walking, kept veering to the right. Both of us probably not knowing what to do, and both of us fortunately deciding to just move along until I got far enough away that I couldn't see the lion anymore, at which point I kicked into high gear and ran the rest of the way home, heart pounding and head knowing that I had been spared, barely. It was scary, obviously, and I trembled, obviously, which is what one does in such circumstances, right? When you're afraid for your life, you tremble. And that, at some level, I think explains these verses, which we just read. The Lord is our creator, after all. Everything begins and ends with Him. We exist by His will. When someone has that much authority and power over your life, it might make some sense to listen to His word, even tremble at His word, as Isaiah talks about, since the implications of that word for us are huge. And so the Bible talks about the fear of the Lord, not as something weird or perverted, but absolutely sane. I mean, why shouldn't we fear the Lord, to rephrase Jeremiah 6? Why shouldn't we tremble in His presence? He made us. We are His. And to the extent that we know that and understand it as we say we do as Christians, then why wouldn't we tremble? I mean, if I tremble while facing a routine mountain lion, why wouldn't I tremble facing the Lion of Judah? Or the Lion of Narnia, for that matter? I mean, that lion created that lion below. What sense then does it make for me to fear him and not him? Well, at some level, it makes no sense at all, which is why this is a puzzling moment, and probably why I've waited all these years to even broach the topic. I mean, let's face it, one obvious conclusion that you might reach is that we don't really believe in this God. If we did, we would act like He's the Lion of Lions, but we don't. So maybe we're just a bunch of charlatans who don't really believe what we say we believe. The problem is, I don't really believe that. I don't think that's the case. At least in my experience, people who call themselves Christians are mostly genuine believers. We don't all believe exactly the same thing, and we've got our bad days and our good days, but we certainly believe in God, and we generally are trying to figure out what that means for our lives, for our living, for our being. And all the data that I have seen would bear that out. Churches are full of hypocrites, to be sure, but we're not lying about the point of our faith. We do believe in God. So that doesn't seem to explain this, to me, at least. Another argument that's often used here, and I've used it myself since it fits with my own scholarly interests, is to explain the problem in terms of the culture in which we live and the difference between our culture and the ones that existed through most of human history and certainly during the time of the Old and New Testament. To be blunt, we don't have kings and queens anymore, at least not ones that are sovereign and to whom we bow down and praise and fear because they might separate our heads from our bodies at any moment in time. Our leaders have power, to be sure, more than we know in some case, but they don't want us to fear them. Our leaders want us to love them, admire them, vote for them so they can stay in office. And we kind of take them in stride. If things are going well, we'll say a good word about them. If not, we castigate them and call them names. They're a bunch of jerks, or so we think. In other words, we don't fear kings and rulers on earth. And so it's not easy for us to fear the King of Kings in heaven. End of argument. I do think this argument has some merit and might even be part of the problem. But I think it's important to notice that while we don't fear kings anymore, we do fear a lot of other things. It's not like we've given up on fear altogether. We still fear lions, for example, at least I do. We might fear getting caught for speeding or whatever else we do wrongly. Some of us fear heights. Some of us fear being alone or being with the wrong people or being in debt or whatever. I mean, we have fears up the wazoo. And some of them worry us to death, quite literally. So the problem is that we don't know how to fear. We just don't fear God. So why not? Well, the argument that I hear the most often, and especially when I'm talking to Christians in moments of honest reflection, is that they don't fear God because doing so doesn't make sense. He's a God of love, after all, a God of grace. He loved us so much that he went to the cross for us, bore our sins on that cross, died for us, in fact, forgave us when we didn't deserve it, and now calls us to forgive others as he has forgiven us. In other words, our God is a God of immense compassion and grace. How could we then fear him? In fact, we shouldn't, should we? Doesn't make any sense. So maybe all this trembling stuff was just, the Old Testament, before Jesus, before we actually found out what a sweet fellow this God of heaven actually is. I'm being a little over the top here, I know. But that does ring a bell, doesn't it? It does with me. This is one that I can feel personally, that I felt personally at times. And certainly I've heard it from others quite often, from many of you, in fact, as we've talked in my office or in class. So this one rings a bell. Bottom line, we know that our God is a God of grace, and grace has nothing to do with fear, we think. But maybe we should think again, or sing again, a song that we all know by heart, I'm guessing. Actually, we're going to be singing it here in not too long, a few minutes. But it won't be the first time, because this is one song that nearly all of us know and love, no matter our age. no matter our background. Even quasi-Christians seem to like this song for some reason. But we born-again folks, well, we really love this one because it gets at something we know without a doubt. And that is the amazing grace of God, which is the name of the song. In case you're wondering, Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Hard to sing that song, actually, and not get a few tears if you're really into it, because it's so true and so absolutely right. And so revealing to our question this morning, right? I mean, why don't we tremble before God? Because we know His amazing grace, His love. So how could we tremble? Except this. It turns out that this song, which we say we love and believe, has a very interesting verse, which we've sung over and over again, but don't seem to remember, even though it's the second verse, even though it says this: "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved." Was grace that taught my heart to fear. What does that mean? Grace relieving my fears, I understand that, but a grace that taught my heart to fear? Well, think for a second. What brought you to Christ in the first place? What was it that taught you the meaning of God's grace? The need for it, for one thing, but your need for it, for another. Well, if you're anything like me, it was most likely a searing realization of who you really are before a holy, righteous God. I don't know about you, but I'm not righteous. I'm a jerk. I'm selfish. I'm totally preoccupied with my own needs and wants. And I've got an ego that won't quit. If pride cometh before a fall, I'm the fall. I remember in high school, for example, being part of conversations that were just awful. And they happened all the time. I don't mean awful in the use of language, by the way. I generally tried to be above the crowd in terms of general vulgarities. But they were awful relative to other people. I mean, we would cut others down, splay them for our own entertainment, make ourselves look good by castigating others who were not in the conversation. And some of these others that we were dicing were friends, good friends. I remember one day in particular when I was doing exactly that. I was having a great time ripping into a certain friend for some stupid thing that he did. Everyone laughing and enjoying my critique. But then suddenly seeing that same friend, while I was talking about him, at a distance, walking along alone on campus. In my mind's eye, I actually thought I saw him turning his head and looking at me. Not sure about that. Could have just been my guilt at play. But it was a moment that absolutely remained frozen in time. Here I was, berating a friend behind his back who had been a faithful companion to me since kindergarten. Why? Because I wanted to look good. That's why. Because being cool in that moment was more important than being a friend for life. I walked away from that conversation and I started to cry. Skipped my next class, in fact. Got into my car and just began driving. And thinking about what I had done. What I did all the time, in fact. And I was absolutely overwhelmed. First, by the miserable sham that I was. And second, what a distance there was between who I wanted to be, or should be, and who I really was. My friends didn't know it, but I knew it. And most certainly, my Lord and my God knew it. Before Him and the heavenly hosts, my life was laid bare. And it was frightening. No other way to describe it. But, and this is one of those important buts, it was a fear that led to repentance. And in time, a much deeper realization of just how amazing God's grace and forgiveness really is, because it included me, of all things, even me. But here's the thing to note. Those moments, those awful moments when we see ourselves clearly as we are, as hard as they might be, are moments of grace. Because without them, we wouldn't see. Indeed, we would just keep going down that path we were on, call it the path of destruction. Which means it was grace that taught my heart to fear on that day, and grace my fears relieved. Because it turns out that when you get your fears straight, you lose them. They're gone. All of them, in fact. All of them except one. And now I want to assert something that is highly controversial. So be on guard. Feel free to dismiss it if you believe otherwise. This isn't my area of expertise, and I'm just basing it on experience. So this could be wrong. But I think it's true. All of us fear something. That's the assertion. All of us fear something. Indeed, not fearing something is not really an option in life. It doesn't exist. The only question before us, I would claim, is not will we fear, but will we fear rightly? Take, for example, that situation with my friend in high school that I described just a few minutes ago when I was berating my friend in front of a group of lesser friends. If you had been there, I'm guessing that you would have concluded that I was a rather self-confident 16-year-old. I used words quickly, with stealth, putting down others and making myself look good in the process. Minimally, I appeared to be enjoying myself, but did so by saying whatever came to mind, regardless of who it might hurt in the process. Bold fellow, you might conclude. Wrong. Totally, completely wrong. I was, in fact, a weakling, gutless, promoting myself at the expense of a friend. Strength doesn't do that, by the way, not real strength. My actions at that moment were not grounded in confidence, but in fear. Fear of not being liked by my peers. Fear of being a nobody when I desperately wanted to be a somebody. It was the sin of pride, of course, masquerading as self-confidence, as it often does, but being rooted in a very deep fear of my own worthlessness, my own inconsequentiality. And here's the really sad thing. I doubt I'm alone. Indeed, I rather guess that I'm in very good company on this planet we call Earth. Our fears come out differently, of course. Some of us are much better at hiding them than others. Indeed, some of us repress them for years, walking around as if we don't fear a thing. But those who are closest to us, they know the truth, as do we in our moments of honesty. While falling asleep late at night, perhaps, while taking a shower in the morning and thinking of everything that's we're facing in the day. Or in my case, when I looked up in the midst of that moment when I was berating my friend and saw that same friend at a distance, walking by himself and turning to look at me. In that moment, there was only one way to find relief, only one true way out. And it is not to repress your fears, which never works, by the way, at least not for long, but rather to fear rightly. It is, in fact, the fear of God that you need more than anything else in the world. A fear that will not only put all those other fears to shame, they will look like nothing, but open you up to the reality of the most amazing grace you'll ever find. A grace born of God's love, a grace that will not only teach you how to fear rightly, but a grace your fears relieve. The Bible claims that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I fear it might be right. What do you think? Let's sing Amazing Grace, and we'll turn to page 202, and